it comes to governance as well. So the objective of compliance is to have a balance, right? Um, if you think a couple of years ago, a lot of companies starting tightening up security. So people would have to do VPN to get into the environment to access a file. What people would do is just email the file to their personal email, so they don't have to VPN. Kind of creating the perfect storm for the shadow IT. So you really have to have a balance between how are you going to manage your controls and stability versus providing what the customer or your end customer needs. Because think about it, right? We want to work from any device, anywhere, anytime. Um, we don't want to be tied to a desk. So that actually really becomes a challenge now because you have to think about the entire ecosystem and how that's going to affect you from a compatibility and security and compliance standpoint. So from that aspect, when you are moving to the cloud, you really need to have a cloud governance team. Sure, you're going to have a cloud adoption team, which is going to be taking care of um, your planning, your migration, but the cloud governance team has to be there to make sure uh, that everything is checked and is in balance. And one of the things I've seen is a lot of companies say, okay, we'll just use refactor our on-prem governance team. That sometimes causes a lot of problem because, for example, if you have your own data center, so you might not have any data residency compliance issues, but when you move to the cloud, that becomes an issue. So let's say if you are in Europe and you have to abide by GDPR, then you might not be able to host your data in other countries outside of Europe, right? So that becomes really a compliance issue. The cloud governance team has to take a look and see, okay, how's that going to be adopted? Are we in compliant? How do we make sure that none of the resources are spun up in other regions which are not compatible from a compliance standpoint? So that's why it's imperative to have a cloud governance team, which is going to make sure that these things are taken care of before you even start uh, implementing anything in the cloud. So now you must be asking, okay, why is governance important, right? So these are some of the questions you should really be asking. Who is responsible for monitoring and supporting cloud operations? Because this is going to look very different from your on-prem environment, right? Cloud is, as I said, cloud is very flat. So on-prem, you might have a person who's provisioning just servers. Other team might be taking of storage or whatnot. When you come into the cloud, from an operational standpoint, one person would be provisioning the compute, storage, and networking. So, from a compute standpoint, somebody has to provision the virtual machine. From a networking standpoint, somebody has to make sure, okay, if you need a VPN, could be site-to-site VPN or could be Azure Express Route, how that's going to be affected. So that person could be doing it. And then from a storage standpoint, what kind of storage are we looking for, right? So one person probably would be doing the entire thing because they have to set up the service. And Azure has so many services that it's pretty much impossible to know all the services, but people would get exposed to all the services. So you have to kind of define with the RACI, who's going to be responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed, because not everybody can be responsible, not everybody can be accountable. There has to be one person who is going to be responsible, right? So those things have to be accounted for, and what services should be migrated. So again, depending on what workloads are you going to be moving to the cloud. Some companies say, okay, we want to start moving our least critical services to the cloud first, just to get an idea how that's going to look like. And who's going to be managing the environment? What roles and responsibilities must be defined? Is that going to be going hand in hand with the on-prem people, or is it going to be completely new because um, we might have a different compliance requirement? And, these requirements are going to differ based on your company size. So if you are really a small company, the IT department might be wearing multiple hats, but if you're an enterprise customer or sometimes even mid-market, those responsibilities might come to an individual. So those things have to be accounted for. What security measures should be considered? Again, compliancy. Some companies have to abide by SOC 2, especially in the financial sector. How do we account for that? What are the risks for that? Um, so that needs to be accounted for. What are the core processes needed for service management? That has to be defined as well. Uh, what about how do we ensure balance between innovation, cost, and agility? As I said, cloud is a consumption model, right? So your cost is going to be high. The more you use it, the more it's going to be. So you want to make sure you don't break the bank. And one of the challenges with cloud is you don't get your bill right away, right? Like once you're doing the consumption, you'll probably get the invoice after 30 days, which is already too late. Um, Obviously, after 30 days, you might turn your services down, but then for that period that has passed, you pretty much already have gone above budget. So that's the challenge. You have to have some kind of structure for that, and make sure that your organization understand how that's going to be done and what organization changes are needed, because with the cloud and on-prem environment, it is going to be a hybrid environment, so it is going to be different how you manage that environment. And what key capabilities must be developed? As I mentioned before, the biggest gaps I've seen is skill set. Cloud is moving at a rapid pace, and keeping up is a challenge. So having that top of mind is going to be very important as well. So these are, hopefully that kind of gives you an idea why governance is so important when it comes to cloud. Um, Looking at this is, you can run this because of the time. I'm not going to go through this, but at your leisure, you can run the assessment. This is a great tool. It's going to walk you through multiple scenarios or questions, and based on that, it's going to provide you feedback. So feel free to run this tool when you get a chance. And then talking about cloud governance model, right? The cloud adoption governance model. Um, there are 5 disciplines that you have to kind of take a look at that. The cost management, security baseline, resource consistency, identity baseline, and deployment acceleration. I'm not going to go through all of them because honestly, each discipline would take a session by itself. Uh, but I'll basically go through some of the things that should be done. So the biggest thing when you are moving to the cloud, or I guess any project, is identifying the risk. What are the business risks that we should identify right off the bat? And the risk, as you might be aware, there are 2 kind of risks. They're known risk and unknown risk, right? So you have to kind of figure out, okay, what could be those potential risks that we can run into while moving to the cloud, and how is that going to affect our compliancy uh, from a compliance standpoint? Because at the end of the day, if you have to abide by a compliancy and then your audits don't go through, then that's going to be an issue. I've had customers come to us and say, hey, we need to pass this audit, and the timeline is very tight, so get everything done, like yesterday. Uh, so you have to kind of plan this upfront and make sure the processes are very well defined before you start moving into the cloud. So now I'm going to talk about some of the native tools that the cloud adoption framework gives you. So with The built-in tools, the native tools are um, quite a bit, and obviously I'm not going to go through all of them, but from a cost management standpoint, the Azure Cost Management does a phenomenal job of tracking the cost for you. Obviously, if you're a multi-cloud shop, you might go third-party um, like Cloudamize or whatnot. Sorry, Cloud Checker. But if you're just using Azure, the cost management does a great job. And actually, you can bring like AWS cost preview into cost management as well. So that's one piece. For um, resource management, you can use Azure Blueprint. Azure Blueprint, funny, it's been in preview for 2 years now. Hopefully, Microsoft actually makes it GA, but it's a great tool. Although I would not recommend using it in production because there's not going to be any SLA or support on it. But on the other hand, Azure Policy is a great tool that should be used, and I'll talk about Azure Policy at the end of the presentation. The other tools are Azure Monitor, Azure Advisor. So those are other great things for you to manage. And then from an identity standpoint, which is huge, RBAC, role-based access control, that should be done, right? What I've seen is a lot of people just turn on RBAC and then give everybody owner access, which is pretty much a no-no. You need to limit the access you provide. So those kind of things have to be accounted when you're starting the project. And then obviously from a deployment and management aspect, you can use Azure Monitor, which gives you a great view. Obviously, you can integrate third-party tools as well, but these are the native tools from a Azure standpoint. And let's talk about the third-party tools, right? Obviously, this is not a exclusive list, but some of the tools are there. And then one of the prominent tools I would say is HashiCorp. A lot of people are using HashiCorp, especially from a Terraform standpoint. Everybody is trying to automate things now. Infrastructure as code is huge. Honestly, nobody should really be doing click and mouse now because there are a lot of challenges with not automating if you have a larger environment. So you should be automating a lot of things, and they're depending on what kind of cloud governance you have. You can use all the third parties, and it does take some time to understand how these things are going to be integrating, and depending on what things you might even have. Sometimes talking to customers, they already have tools that they want to integrate with Azure as a third party, which is fine. But if you're looking for other third parties, there are many options now. So it really depends what are you trying to achieve. But these are some tools that should give you an idea from a third party aspect. Now let's understand the business risk that is going to come through that you need to be I guess identify, right off the bat. So what are the compliance requirements? So that's the biggest question you need to ask yourself when you are moving to the cloud. As I've mentioned, depending on where you are, if you're in Europe, if you're in North America, or even Far East, like even if you're in Australia or Singapore, every country is going to have a different compliance requirements. So you need to figure out, okay, what compliance requirements do we have and how's that going to work? And you have to identify your business risk, how it relates to cloud. For example, I'm in Canada, so we have 2 data centers in Canada. Sometimes, the health entities or the government cannot have any data outside of Canada. So that's a risk because that compliancy is a risk because then nothing should be provisioned for that should be, or actually no service should be provisioned that would be outside of Canada. So those business risks have to be identified beforehand. And then The other thing is, what are the other data and governance risks? So data is becoming prevalent now because, truth be told, we're producing data, every single day. Think about even on a personal level. We have so much personal accounts now. Even social media, you might have multiple social media accounts, and then the data we're producing on a day-to-day basis, right? So even companies now are producing data, and then how is that going to impact you as a business and your customers? How are you going to be securing data? We hear every day companies getting compromised, so their personal data, PII, right, is compromised. So you have to have a data governance to make sure that data is secure, um, and how are you going to make sure that if something happens, uh, you know, um, there has to be a fallback on that as well, and how that's going to affect your business as well. And lastly, when you have audits for compliancy, what would that look like, and how should you prepare for the compliancy for the audits? So changing gears now, I'll talk about the Azure resources. As so, first thing what happens is, let's say when you create a Azure tenant, you get the root account, right? So you get the tenant. There's nothing there. Then you'll have to go in there and get a subscription. Now, the subscription could be from anywhere. Could be a CSP, cloud service provider, could be an enterprise agreement, could be pay as you go, could be your MSDN account, right? So there are multiple ways how you can get a subscription. And then once you have a subscription, what happens is you're going to be building resource groups and then resources underneath. So the resources are your actual services. So if you're spinning up a, let's say, Azure SQL Server, that's going to be a resource. Your VNets, your virtual machines, those are resources. So um, the biggest thing about governance is how do you tackle that, um, and then how is that going to change from a timestamp as you move forward. What I see from a lot of customers is they started small and they did not have a strategy of how that's going to look like. So what I'll talk in the next couple of slides is um, like a MVP, minimum viable product for your management group, your subscriptions and whatnot. So we'll take a look at that. So what exactly is resource consistency? Right, in the previous slide, I kind of talked about your management group. So management group is your top level group. Um, when you set up the tenant, you get a root management group. Now, you can obviously rename it and change it, although you would need a owner permission on that to change it. Generally speaking, what happens is people leave that root management group as is, and then create subscriptions or create other management group depending on the organization. We will talk about in the next couple of slides, but the management group is really defined as a hierarchy. Uh, and depending on your organization, so it could be based on the department or it could be based on geographical location as well, right? So and we'll see that in the next couple of slides. From a subscription, as I explained, subscription is basically going to be talking about how you start consuming your services, and lastly your resource groups. So from a management group best practices standpoint, you can have a corporate IT, which is going to be your root management group, and then you can break it down into production development and quality assurance. And then underneath that, you can do subscriptions and resource groups. So this pretty much gives a good idea of how your management group should look like. And then from the governance MVP, most viable, or sorry, minimum viable product consideration, you should start small, geographical location, or even you can do your environment as well. Now, from a subscription standpoint, it really depends on how your organization look like. In this example, we see two examples. One is the design model where they're splitting it out between development, lab, QA, and production. The other one is based on the business unit, HR, financial, and marketing. And then one of the questions I really get is, do we need single subscription or multiple subscription? It really depends on your environment. I would say people need multiple subscription. I hardly see anybody going with single subscription because there are multiple reasons for that. But yeah, I would say go with multiple subscriptions. It is much easier to manage, but don't go crazy. I've seen people having 15, 20 plus subscriptions, which gets too complicated to manage. So keep it simple. And then from a subscription standpoint, it really depends on the dev and test environment, separation of duties, how you are going to be managing your environment. So that is going to be where you can define how subscription looks like. And then with the role-based access control, what you can do is you need to assign access to your subscriptions, and you can actually assign to your management groups and whatnot. So one of the things I recommend is using custom roles for your RBACs. The only caveat to that is you would have to buy the Azure AD premium license for that, either P1 or P2, depending on the custom license you're looking for. So that's one of the things you can do on the RBAC side of things. So Adana, are we out of time or do we have more time?
Yeah, we are on time. We just have 5 more minutes. If you can, let me see if there are any questions. I don't see any, and
okay.
You can just go for a conclusion in 3 to 4 minutes.
Okay.
And our next speaker is also here, so we are good.
Okay, sounds good. Not a problem. So what I'll do is basically I'll go through Azure policy real quick because I think this is going to help everybody, and then we can wrap up after that. So one of the biggest things about compliancy is you can use Azure policy from a compliancy standpoint, and the reason is you can take a look and see, okay, if your environment is compliant or not. For example, the use cases for Azure policy could be only allowing resources type that can be deployed. As I mentioned in the beginning, if you do not have a compliance or governance board, people are going to be spinning up everything in Azure. So you need to have Azure policies to limit what people can provision. So maybe, for example, you are limiting the SKU types of virtual machines to help control with the cost. Not everything would be spin up at that point. Or you're only allowing resource type to be provisioned in the approved geographical region. So that can be done with Azure policy as well. And the multiple ways of doing this, and because of time, I'm just going to walk fairly quickly on how the best practices are. So I do not recommend you start enforcing. Start with audit. Once you audit the environment, that should be good to go. And then because the problem is if you start enforcing it, you're going to run into a lot of issues, even especially from a deny aspect. So you do not want to deny everything. You want to start auditing from an auditing standpoint, and then maybe some things you can deny, but audit is the right way to do. So with that being said, that concludes my session. So thank you so much for the opportunity. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask any questions.
So I don't see any of the questions posted so far. So I think we are good here. And thank you so much, Kazi, for your time and for your session.